In this video, I'm going to show you how to add colors and change colors in InDesign. InDesign's homepage is up. I'm going to hit Create New once again and go through the same process I always do. Create. And I'm just going to start with a basic rectangle. So I'm going to grab my rectangle tool, draw this out, and right now I can see that there's no fill and no stroke, meaning that that's invisible. If I were to grab my arrow tool, click off of it, and hit W for preview mode, I'd see that there's actually nothing on the page. All right. To work with color, we're going to start with what we call our swatches palette. So you're going to go up to Window, scroll to Color, and then off of Color, choose Swatches. And these are the swatches that we have available by default in InDesign. So the first thing we have is None. The second we have is Registration, which looks black. And then if you notice 2 down, there is an actual black. And the difference is Registration is using all plates to print, meaning that if you're using a CMYK printer, cyan, magenta, yellow, black, this color here is going to be a mix of all 4 colors. We use that to make sure that the printer heads are aligned, or in old offset printing, that the plates are aligned, right? So you don't want to use this typically if you want something to look black, because this will have a hint of color to it. For black, just use black. The one in between those looks white, but it says paper. And this is something that throws some students off. The big difference with this, the reason we don't call it white, is because this tells InDesign don't print anything here. And normally, if you don't print anything, you see the color of the paper through it, which is typically white. But if I were to use a blue piece of paper, anything I didn't print is going to show in blue because the paper is blue and I don't have white ink in my printer. So we don't call this white. It's really just telling the printer, leave this space alone, right? So paper represents the color of your paper. We have then black, cyan, which is 100% cyan, 0 magenta, no yellow, no black. Magenta, no cyan, all magenta, no yellow, no black. So CMYK, cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Yellow, no cyan, no magenta, full yellow, no black. And then we have RGB, or red, green, blue. Red, which is cyan 15, magenta 100, yellow 100, black 0. Green, cyan is at 75, magenta is at 5, yellow is at 100, black is at 0. And blue, cyan's at 100, magenta is at 90, yellow is at 10, and black is at 0. All right, these colors are my basic cyan, magenta, yellow, my standard print colors. RGB, my standard web colors or screen colors. And that's why they kind of give us these as our preference or as our defaults. So right now, the way I set a color is I'll grab this so we can see it applied. I'll click on, say, cyan. And that shows my fill gains cyan in it. Now, if I click on my stroke, I can now add, say, yellow. And it's hard to see, but now it has this thin yellow outline. Now, if I go to my properties, I'll see my fill is blue or cyan. My stroke is yellow, and I can up the stroke size, and you could say, oh, okay. And if I hit W for preview mode, I have yellow and cyan. Right, I'm going to grab another shape, or I can make a quick copy. If I hold down Option, I can drag out a copy, and this just duplicates what I had. It's just a quick version of a copy and paste. And say for that one, I want this to be red, and I want it to have a blue stroke. Actually, let's go with a magenta stroke so we can see what happens here. All right. So one thing I want to point out is we have a couple options for color here. If I click on my fill color, so again, whichever one you're changing is whichever one's in front, whichever one I clicked on. So I have my red here, and I'm going to change the tint of my red. And tint, by definition, is a value change. It means to add white. So essentially, the printer is going to print less red and show more white through. Right? So that's changing the tint of that color. Now, I stacked this very intentionally so that you could see something. I'm going to hold Option, drag out another. I'm going to put the tint back up. A lot of people confuse tint for opacity. There is a difference here. So if I grab this now and I go to my opacity, which is in my properties, yes, it lowered the color, but I can see through this one. I can't see through this. And this also affected my stroke and my fill. This only affected my fill. All right? So it's important to know that there is a big difference between opacity and tint. Tint is, again, letting more white show through, not letting everything show through. So now say I wanted a different color. I want some sort of orange or something like that. I'm going to just change my tint back. What I can do to get a new color, make sure I can see the full palette here. I'm just going to pull the bottom of this up a little bit. So in my swatches palette, I can click this little plus sign here for new swatch. And then if I double click on this, I can edit this swatch. So the first thing it's going to say, I'm going to check preview as always. Swatch name, it's going to be named with the value, meaning that the recipe, so to speak, is the name of this color. And I can start to change my color value here. And I can see a change on screen. So there's this orange color that I want maybe. All right. There you go. So I have a bright orange. And now I hit OK, I have this color. Some people are going to do this in a different way. Some people will say, oh no, don't do that. It takes too long. Use the color palette, use this, use that. Let me show you why I do it this way. So say I chose that orange color, and then I've done a bunch more in my design. I have some circles that also use that orange color, for example. And then I even have some type that uses this orange color. I'm just going to draw a type box down here. Type, fill with placeholder text. I'm going to make it nice and large. And I'm going to color that type. And just like with everything else, you can see there's a type T there. I click on orange. All right. So now I have this design here, and say this goes on and on and on for pages and pages. And then some point down the road, I decide that that orange doesn't work for me anymore. Instead of having to go and find every one on every page, I might be able to do something a little easier. I can just double click in here, and what's called a global change is I can say, you know what, actually I'd rather that be purple. And I can change it once in here, and it changes all the instances of that color. If I did this with a color palette, I would not get that reaction. Right? So this is one of the reasons I always use my swatches palette for this, because it allows us that global control. All right, so I find that pretty important. I'm going to just delete these guys for a second. We'll talk more about color with a text box. So color with text, you just have to be careful that you don't do something of low contrast. And by low contrast, I mean you don't want to put yellow text on a white background or something of that nature. You want to make sure that there's enough that people can really see. The other thing that I think is important, and I'm going to use my guides, I always want to make sure things are lined up. So I'm just going to go all the way to the top, and maybe I'll do a 2-column layout as well. So layout, margins and columns, 2 columns, all right, so I have this 1 column of text here. It's half my page. I even want to go as far as to say left justify, so I have a pretty hard right side. Okay. Hit W, see what that looks like. Now, I want to make this a purple box with white text for some reason. I don't know why. I can also click on, if I grab it not with the type tool, because if I grab a word, I can select just that and change those colors. But I can also grab with my selection tool or my arrow tool, and I can give a background color. All right, let me click on that little square right there, and now I have this. Well, it's going to be very hard to see my text. But if I then go and say text, paper, for example. All right, so now I have white text on a purple background. Now, because this is what we call knockout, it's white on a color, you may want to go with a thicker text. Makes it a little easier to see. All right. And on top of that, what I may, and I'm going to space it out just a little bit more. What I might also want to do is, I don't love the way this looks on the edge. This is something that's kind of very indicative of amateur designers or beginning designers, where this text goes right to the edge of that color and it just doesn't look great. So what I'm going to do is grab my text box, Command B, and change my inset spacing. So that indents my text away from the edge of the text box. Nothing too crazy, just a little bit of an indent, which makes that look a lot more legible. Let me grab this again. I'll make a copy and just show you them side by side. So this one I will Command B and take that off. And hopefully you agree, but this to me looks a bit more amateurish, a little harder to read. This here looks a little cleaner, a little nicer. I also probably wouldn't do something quite so straining on the eye. A lot of negative type like that tends to be a bit much. If I were to do something like this where I wanted it to stand out, I may, let's see, using purple, I might do a much less intense version of that purple. Maybe lower the tint out. So maybe something like this, where I still get that purple. But now, because I'm missing that contrast, go back to black text. And now I can go with something a little thinner, a little smaller. And that'll be a little easier to read. That'll look a little bit more kind of professional, hopefully, than something like this, which looks a little intense. Right, so we can use colors for shapes. We can use colors for text, for background colors. And once you add them to your swatches palette, we have a lot of control over them. So you can always go back and make these changes down the road. So hopefully you guys can take advantage of that and add it to your designs.